to the House.
Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
Sir Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I rise to respond to the speech just given by the Minister. The Minister, who should really be spending his time this evening wondering why he didn't pay more attention to the fraud happening in the Ministry of Transport. But instead he's talking about this series of changes instead. So, Mr Speaker, the Land Transport Amendment Bill will be supported by the Labour Party, but with serious reservations, actually. Because, if I can say at the outset, many of the technical changes that the Minister described before are things that will make a small amount of difference. They are sensible, they are practical. In particular, we want to support the mandatory sentences for alcohol interlocks, which is something that we think will improve this government's poor record on the road toll, which has started increasing. It looks like now this year will be the 4th year in a row that the road toll will increase, against the trend of decades of coming down, and, Mr Speaker, in fact, against the international trend, where other similar countries to us are experiencing the road toll coming down year after year. Under this government's regime, we've got the opposite happening, with the road toll going up and all of the grief and tragedy that causes for the friends and family of the deceased. So the alcohol interlock measure in this bill will be an improvement to road safety, as are some of the provisions about overloaded trucks. Although I've got to say, Mr Speaker, that if the government was really serious, they wouldn't keep introducing larger and larger trucks on our roads that just are not fit to carry those larger trucks, and therefore increasing the incidence of crashes and fatal crashes at that on our roads. So there are many areas that we do support. And the area that was probably the most contentious, though, of this bill was the bit about the small passenger service vehicles, because this is the part, and I think the intention is correct. That is to ensure that as technology improves and changes, that some of those new services are now captured, and that there is a level playing field that is going to be presented. And that's admirable in its intent, but I'm not sure that this bill actually brings that about in a very safe way, because it's my view, and it's Labour's view, that the role of this Parliament is to, when it comes to small passenger services, and that's not services for small passengers, this is small passenger vehicle services, that our role is to ensure the public safety. That is our primary role. And the Labour Party doesn't feel that this bill goes far enough in doing that. So we have some amendments that we will be proposing at committee stages, and I'm going to outline them now. The two areas of most concern to us exist around the removal in this bill of braille signage, and also the removal of the requirement for in-vehicle cameras. These are two major public safety issues. And the reason why we are so concerned about public safety is that we know that the track record of deregulation under national governments has caused this country great grief in the past. So we've only got to think about Pike River Mine. We've only got to think about where a national government deregulated and removed mining inspectors, and that was a significant cause of what happened at Pike River Mine. We've only got to think of the thousands of New Zealanders whose livelihoods and lives have been affected because they have weather-damaged buildings, houses, because the weather tightness is not correct, because, again, a national government deregulated the building industry and the standards, and therefore we ended up with a leaky homes crisis in New Zealand. We've only got to look at those two examples to know that we have to be very careful when a national government deregulates in the way that this bill in fact does, because deregulation is the catch cry of a national government. They love deregulating, but they ain't so keen to put their hands up to actually be accountable for the results of it. And with small passenger vehicle services, the fact is, Mr Speaker, that people who are using the services, apart from MPs who are, using taxis and maybe Ubers from, the airport and back to Parliament, but for the majority of people, they are using the services when they are impaired, one way or the other. And in fact, the largest number of submissions that we had on this bill came from people who were organisations that were representing people with disabilities, because they are utterly, in many cases, utterly dependent on these services for every movement that they make, because they do not have the ability to drive themselves, and often taking public transport is not an option for them either. So they are utterly dependent on this service, and these services need to be safe for them because they are extremely vulnerable. So that's the reason why we want to ensure that the requirement for braille signage is not stripped out of these services, because people representing those who are sight impaired told us how important that was for them, to have certainty over what vehicle they were in, so that if anything untoward did happen, they could report it. That was a measure, that was something that was very important to them for their security. But the other group of people who are, of course, when we talk about impairment, often people are using the services because they've been out and they've had a bit too much to drink. Well, they've certainly had too much to drink to drive themselves home. Or they may be involved in other substances and they're using these services. Again, very vulnerable when they are in those situations. And so this is the reason why we are insisting and asking this Parliament to back our call to ensure that the current provisions for in-vehicle cameras remains. Because after all, those provisions were only brought in 2011, Mr Speaker. That's not very long ago. It was the national government that put that requirement in place. Why did they do that? Well, they did it on the back of two vicious murders of two taxi drivers, Hiran Mohini in 2010 and Abdul Rahman Ikhtari in 2008. Those two men were brutally murdered. They were taxi drivers, and those murders led to the decision by this Parliament to insist that in-vehicle cameras were installed in certain circumstances. And the government may well argue that that's no longer necessary because new technology is going to fix all this and it's going to be all fine because, you're going to use your app and you're going to dial up the Uber or the taxi and they're going to know who you are and you're going to know who they are. So it's all sweet. Except that we had a man come and do a submission to our select committee. He came into our select committee and he said, "I'm Rod Stewart." He clearly wasn't Rod Stewart, but he had been able to register himself using Rod Stewart's, the rock star's, actual photo and calling himself Rod Stewart. He had been able to register himself as an Uber driver. And Uber accepted him as being Rod Stewart, with the hair and all. He clearly wasn't Rod Stewart. He looked completely different to Rod Stewart. I don't know what his singing voice was like. He didn't demonstrate that to us, but you could see he wasn't Rod Stewart. However, he was able to become an Uber driver as Rod Stewart, pick people up as Rod Stewart. They didn't say, "Hey, you're not Rod Stewart," when they got in the car. But worse than that, he actually then lodged a complaint against himself as Rod Stewart. He lodged a complaint against himself, and he still was able to keep driving Ubers. Nothing happened. So I think this shows us the folly of relying entirely on new technology to give us assurance of public safety. It clearly won't do that. Since the 2011 amendment that brought in the in-vehicle cameras, not only have we not had any murders happening in taxis, but in fact the findings were that in just 2 years later, that the number of violent incidents that had happened in taxis dropped by 40%, simply because the in-vehicle cameras were there. So this is something we should be embracing, Mr Speaker, not getting rid of. And that government, I fear, is going down their good old deregulation track again, when deregulation becomes the captain to it all and they forget about public safety. Thank goodness for the Labour Party, because we're here to remind them that our job in regard to regulating these services is public safety first. Public safety first. And if it means a little bit of compliance cost, public safety comes ahead of that. Because that's the mistake that was made in Pike River Mine, where safety was put behind compliance costs. It was also the mistake that was made with leaky buildings as well. So let's please learn from those mistakes and not repeat it, and let's get it right this time round. So at the committee stages, I will have those 2 amendments to put forward. I do believe that they are things that will make a considerable difference to public safety as we move to ensure that there is regulation across the board that captures all of those services. Now, the other thing I want to say is that the media had a little bit of mischief during our select committee process and pretended that, the problem with MPs is we just didn't know what an app was. Those of us who are on our cell phones all the time don't know what an app is, don't know what Uber is, despite the fact that Uber are in our offices pretty much all the time telling us exactly what Uber is, and came to the select committee and told us several times, over what Uber is. Apparently we were just a bit thick and we don't know what Uber is. Absolutely untrue. But what we do want to make sure of...
I'm sorry to interrupt, because I was interested in hearing the end of the story, but your time has expired.
Maybe committee stages.
Jonathan Young.